Welcome to the BFDG Guild Forum on We Hunt Together, which is a TV show for Alibi and Showtime in the States.
You need an alibi.
D.I. Jackson Mendy.
You're Lola Franks, right?
Yes.
We're to partner up for this one. Why leave him chained up?
They wanted to humiliate him.
I don't believe the person who did it had any control over their actions.
He put his hands around my neck.
He's not going to leave me alone.
God has a plan.
Do you have any experience of a murder investigation at all?
It's quite exciting though, isn't it? Waiting for that knock at the door. Yes, Franks, and this is D.I. Mendy. She was telling the truth.
Well, she's as smart as she says she is.
If you really love me, then...
Love heals. Doesn't destroy.
Do you like to feel intellectually superior to the men you date?
She's hiding something.
Every decision we make is preceded by so many thousands of tiny factors that are completely beyond our control.
I'm Jamie Lapsley, production designer on We Hunt Together, and I'll be joined by Carl Tibbets, director, Ollie Russell, DP for Block One, and Emma Rees, costume designer. Some bits about the Guild. The Guild was formed over 70 years ago with the aim of raising the standards and profile of the art department and protecting the interests of its members. Those core principles still apply today, as we are a flourishing and evolving community of over 520 accredited skilled technicians and designers whose talents span the various branches of the art department in film and television. So I'd like to introduce Carl Tibbets, our director, Ollie Russell, our DP, and Emma Rees, our costume designer. If you'd all like to say a couple of minutes about yourself, where you're from, what you've done, blah, blah, blah.
I'm a writer and director of film and television. You want to know what I've done credits-wise? I've done things like Black Mirror and Humans and Tunnel, things like that.
Okay, cool. Emma, you okay?
Hi, Emma Reeves, costume designer. I've done a few TV things recently. I've done both series of End of the Effing World, We Hunt Together, and The Bisexual, and various other things, and a few feature films.
I'm Ollie Russell, I'm a director of photography, and my credits are things such as Sex Education, Season 1, Dairy Girls, We Hunt Together, Flesh and Blood, to name a few.
Okay, awesome. I mean, I suppose the first thing would be is you, Carl, seeing as you were the first one on the project. Yeah. And the question would be, like, when you got the material, because there's lots of stuff we can talk about in terms of, I know the way we worked through and adapted what was on the page. But what was your first instincts on the project about taking it on?
First of all, I was just really excited by the writing and the tone of the writing, and you don't often get this kind of thing where there's the darkness and the humor and the humanity and the some sort of cinematic or genre ambitions within the writing. Usually, you just don't get that very often in TV, and particularly not in, say, what's traditional procedural sort of police dramas. And so that, and it was interesting, the mix of all of that, the tone. I mean, and that was the major thing, was actually the marriage of the tones, the marriage of the story of, you know, the police story, which is quite a straightforward police procedural on one level, even though the characters do interesting things, and then the sort of fantastical or fantasy elements of Baba and Freddie's story. And you know, by the time I'd read the first draft and I got to sort of the dancing in the alley moment, you know, the way it jumped around in time, and then there was another timeline going on as well. But the dancing in the alley, for that to kind of really land, for that to sort of fit into the world of police procedural, I knew everything else had to be sort of elevated up to the level of that scene in the alleyway. You know, it all had to sort of operate in a slightly unreal world, which was exciting, because what it gave me and gave everybody else was like a freedom to sort of do roughly what we wanted within the parameters of the story. We didn't have to adhere to police procedural. We didn't have to adhere to the standards of it, because the writing was going to free us from that, I guess.
Yeah,
so that was my initial excitement. You know.
Yeah, I think that was the thing, is the tone of it was an open season visually, because to make what was happening in the story and in the editing, which was, some of it was already in the page in terms of those flashbacks, to make that cohesive, it by its nature, it felt like it had to move away from a standardized procedural aesthetic. You know, we really weren't trying to make your average, and not to, you know, having been on those kind of procedural shows, it's not to say they're average in themselves, but the visual reference was not, hopefully not what the audience would expect.
No, it was the I'll just say this really quickly. It was the dancing in the alleyway. It's like, for that to fit into this kind of show, everything else had to kind of be lifted up to that moment, because otherwise it was going to stick out. Otherwise it was going to feel odd in what you would usually expect, you know, from this kind of show.
Yeah, and Ollie, with that dancing in the alleyway moment, that's like a key beat in terms of the visual execution. Like, where did that, if anyone's not seen it, I'll post a little moment of that after this. But where did that idea of the lighting change come from between yourself and Carl? I mean, what was the motivation?
Well, I have to say, I can't actually take credit for that. It was Carl's idea, but obviously take credit for in terms of how he did it. But I think, yeah, it was Carl's idea, but it was like a dream come true, because as Carl said, I think it's like that heightened reality within a show like this, but it still has to be believable that it's reality. So you're kind of, you're trying to sell the idea, I think, that it has that actually happened, or is that in their heads? And I think I think that visual moment, you can go either way with that. I don't think you believe that was an actual lighting change that happened. I think but it doesn't matter. It's kind of to punctuate a moment. And the idea really was Carl's, in that I think, you know, I'm right in saying, Carl, that you were kind of going, you know, it's a connection that they have, and it was sort of, it's dreamlike, and it's really coming from a place of, it's about them, and it's sort of, whether it's inside their heads or not. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think
it's expressionistic. It's expressionistic of what they're feeling. You know what I mean? It's a big metaphor really for the whole thing. Go on, Emma.
The beginning of their sort of the fantasy relationship, and the sort of the creation of the kind of the Hollywood star-crossed lovers sort of idea, that she sort of starts to spin this web of deceit and lies that's sort of based on so many things that she sort of appropriates. And I remember talking about the alleyway scene with you, Carl, about how, like, it's almost like a sort of spark of a crystallization of a kind of Hollywood fantasy sort of for her, and that it should be about, like, the dress that she wore, we talked about it being various different colors, didn't we? But we ended up with something that reflected the light and the surroundings, much like the wet down and the neon, and it's almost like she just sort of becomes a sort of absorbs and reflects at the same time.
Well, she's almost chameleon-esque, isn't she? And she is throughout the whole show. I think she is a bit chameleon-esque, and that was really the first time we see her character. So the dress was perfect for that, because it reflected the light, the design. It was the whole thing, really. And what I actually really loved about that moment, Spotlight, was just that, exactly that. We're in this really colourful, heightened world of our kind of heightened London, if you like. And then it just almost goes, all of that disappears, and it becomes almost black and white. And it literally is, it's you know, those two characters and no one else in the world, almost, which is really, I mean, just such a powerful moment.
It's sort of how Freddie sees it. You know, it's a story she started to spin, a fantasy. You know, we all attach and relate to stories, and we all like stories, you know, and heroes and villains. And she was sort of setting, and this is how she saw her and Baba, you know, that they were going to go off on this great adventure, like Hollywood adventure, you know, and that was the beginning of it. And it was just through Freddie's eyes. And then after that, that kind of informed how we saw them. You know, it happens in the church, you know, when she's sort of talking to her, when they're talking in the church and they decide to make the murder, you know, that is just that's out of the head of somebody who is just a fantasist. You know, that's how she saw it happening, you know.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, I think that moment in itself is kind of key to the concept of making the world and the design and the lighting and the costume explicitly reflective of the character's state of mind at any one point. You know, beyond us kind of fleshing out the background of the world, it felt like an opportunity, and it's something that massively carried through with the lighting, was that became, you know, like you say, it's a fantasy, it's in her head, but it, you know, made a point of trying to put the audience in their minds looking out. So we experience the world the way Freddie experiences it, in a way. It's almost like from her objective point of view, rather than us creating not, I mean, it's realistic, but it's not just like a conventional reality. It was an opportunity to kind of push. And I think when we looked at the start at some of the visual references, we were basing our concepts on the nightclub and the neon and how to carry that through. But it felt like that key idea in terms of realizing the world was something that developed quite early on, and it became you know, essentially a touchstone for us in our discussions with execs as well, and with the writer, and just sort of going back and saying, you know, there's certain elements on page which are written with quite a lyrical flight of fantasy in terms of the way the characters see the world, and there's other stuff which is quite conventional, and allowing us the opportunity to push the stylization in the more conventional moments as well, to help support where we were going. So the audience only got to see our version or Freddie's version or Baba's version of the world. It was never from, I think that's the thing, the idea that the story as we see it is always from a character's point of view, explicitly. There's never anything acutely observational from an audience point of view where they're seeing an event happening. We're with someone in that event and we experience it through their eyes, which I thought was, in terms of the lighting style and what you did, Ollie, with, I mean, Freddie's apartment particularly, you know, kind of we in design pushed the scale and like an eclectic nature in that. But then once the lighting came in, it was next level. I mean, it elevated it massively.
Well, I think that was a thing, you know, that I enjoyed so much about the project, and, you know, what, you know, every project should be about, but it was the collaboration of all of that, you know, it was all of our ideas, wasn't it? And I remember coming on early and, you know, people saying, well, you know, you and Carl particularly, because you started working, you know, with Emma as well together, and then I came in, and the first thing was like, you know, we want the day to still feel like this. The daytime needs to feel like this world as much as the nighttime. So the nighttime is slightly easier in that you can put coloured light in, and you can get these kind of, you know, you can get the reflections, and you can get all of that. The day is a lot harder to do that, particularly exterior. But within Freddie's flat, there was very much that feel of, you know, and when we go and visit Simon's for the, you know, almost the first time in terms of the show, we wanted that kind of hangover of the light from the night before, and I think, you know, I'd like to think we really did achieve that. Like, I think, you know, but that was great, because it was just like, you know, everybody was on board with that, and it was, you know, it was like a joint effort, and it came across in the costume, it came across in the design, and really all I was doing was just, you know, kind of, I suppose, tagging onto that, you know, whatever I was doing and helping with that.
Yeah, and it's like, I thought what was a really great piece of costume, obviously for Freddie, in realizing her and her kind of like exceptionalness as she sees herself, was the pink puffer jacket, you know, the big puffer jacket she had. You know, for me, that just slotted in perfectly into, or whatever, I don't know what the actual name of it is for Freddie, you know, the big
base jacket.
Yeah, no, the big one that she had on all the time, the pink one.
Yeah, like the crop.
Yeah. It sort of just like fitted into the whole, every element that we were doing, like in terms of design wise, with the back, you know, with the designs of the sets, with the sort of the lighting, and, you know, certain to a certain degree with the performances, but with her, it just kind of made her stick out from everybody else, you know.
One thing I want to I'm going to sort of go back to is, with the project particularly, like, you'd chosen a location in London to base ourselves, sort of North London. Yeah. And part of that was this concept of trying to describe a version for the audience that they've never seen before. So trying to stay away from the established. And again, there was lots of beats in the script which referred to, I guess, conventional architecture that the audience might understand, but that sort of choice on your part and on my part as well to push away from that and investigate an architectural vernacular, which from your point of view, you came in quite strong with. This is what we're looking for.
Yeah. It's just that sort of modernist building, or mid-century building, you call it, or something where, what I didn't want to do, particularly with the police station, I'll say this, was just create one of those big open plan blue places, grey places that we've seen before. They are quite, they're great, they're brilliant. They're brilliant, and you've done them very well. Done them fantastically, but they just, it didn't feel like it would sit in the world. I was always, it's just about cohesion. The whole thing was about just trying to be cohesive with it, because it could have come off the rails in terms of the cohesion visually and story-wise. What was always going to keep it grounded, I'll just say this as I talk about it, the performances were always going to be the grounding element for you to be able to identify with and be able to, for people to kind of follow it, whether you like police procedural or whether you liked, true romance or natural born killers. It was like the performances were always going to keep you in a real world. So it didn't, people, were prepared to go on the journey if the performances were sort of grounded. And when we put them in the police station, I don't think anybody's even raised, batted an eyelid or thought about that police station, but it is so different, I think, for a particular police station. We found that, and it was kind of
a complete Hail Mary. Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah, it was like amazing at Sneath Engineering. It was like a time capsule. But again, the reason for choosing these sorts of places was also to create a kind of timelessness to it, a timeless place for it to exist in. So you weren't able to really sort of look at architectural things. I mean, there's phones and there's things, and it is 2020 or 2019, but it's kind of like you weren't immediately associating it with anywhere in particular. You were you recognize it and you understood it, and it was grounded, and it wasn't alienating in its differentness, but it was also kind of nowhere that you'd seen before collectively. Do you know what I mean? And that goes for, Jackson's house, and and Lola's house, and everyone's locations.
And it was also, it was obviously, we were saying it was London, but it also, we weren't saying that it fully was not, like it couldn't. That was the thing, I think, that it was heightened enough to go, yeah, all right, we're just accepting of that. Like you say, we're not kind of going cityscapes of London going, oh, we're in London. It was.
I think there's only one cityscape in episode 1, and it's in South London.
Yeah, but I think that was the thing. It's the idea of trying to strip away the like maybe at a producer level, trying to strip away, from my point of view, selling that argument of trying to strip away their expectation of what they'd see when they read the scene, and say, look, it's a police station, and certain things would come up constantly in the script and in terms of the staging, where we'll be outside the police station, or we'll be in the lobby, or this or that other. Someone would look at something at an iPad, and one thing I think you and I pushed for, Carl, was to lose all of that.
Technology,
really explicit time, things that set us in time. And it was like, let's make all the paperwork and all the police work analog, or if they're going to view it on a screen, they have to go back to the office and try and strip away all of the detail that exists in our lives and the way we work and the way we understand, and those conversations about like police procedure, particularly, like, the detective side of it will follow through, but the technical side of it was something we had to pull back from and just say, no, how did they do this in the 80s, essentially? What is that mechanism? Because from my point of view, I was wary of filling the screen with close-ups of items to inform the audience about what was happening, and trying to constantly pull back from information being displayed on screens more than anything. And it was just like, that having done that on other kind of, governmental or procedural or police stuff, where you're doing info dumps for an audience, and the modern tech is, we'll do it on a screen and everyone will watch it. But actually resisting that explicitly and saying, actually, no, it has to come through performance. And it's always an actor holding something or moving something. It sounds very straightforward, but in terms of the tone of the show, it does make it timeless. It stops it being.
It has an effect. It has an effect on your experience, I think.
Yeah. So just skipping back to locating the series and locating the show in the world in a certain space was the location hunt. And one of the things that happened in hindsight was quite fortuitous was we had some issues in terms of our locations team, not particularly negative, but we found ourselves without a location manager at a key point quite early in prep. So it ended up with myself and Carl and a location scout literally just walking North London, establishing what we thought the world was. And from my point of view, that was fantastic, because by the time we actually had a locations team on board and we'd done that, we built the book, we'd built explicitly beyond like conceptual research and mood boards. We'd actually had places to say to them, it's like, look, architecturally, here's a world we want to put the show in, get us into there. And I think that the work done by the locations team, the various location managers we had and the scouts we had, in hindsight was amazing, because none of it was off the usual location services. It was letter drops. It was people pounding streets, chapping doors. And some of the houses we went into and some of the characters we met as a result of that, some of these locations were astonishing. And what happened was, even though they weren't right for us to shoot in, I think we came away from each of those encounters, each of those spaces, with another kernel of an idea of what this other version of London, this other version of our world could be. And the culmination,
I'll just say, like in that area, or in the North London area, and particularly where we were looking, there's quite a lot of those built, that sort of modernish 70s, 80s or post-war building. We talked about looking for places where the bombs had dropped, and they wiped out whole streets. So you had these Victorian houses, and then all of a sudden this kind of thing that was from the post-war sort of upside down monstrosity, but was beautiful. Do you know what I mean? And we kind of went and searched those sorts of places out, and I'd seen quite a lot of them around where I lived, and I thought, I really like the look of that. I'm going to try and get that in somewhere. And when we went out and finally walked the streets, pounded the streets, literally, I mean,
dying in the hot sun, it was just
literally walked the streets and all. It's basically, we just we knew what we wanted. I'd seen quite a lot of those places around, like driving around, and peculiar houses. And, like I say, with quite a lot of drama, you find also characters live in places that that those characters can't possibly afford quite a lot of time, or that they live in houses and stuff that you're just like, this is just a beautiful backdrop to photograph. And that's fair enough, and it works, and it has a different effect for a different reason, but it's quite aspirational. And it's like I was always looking for something where I thought maybe that was more characterful, that would say something a bit about the characters, rather than was just a sort of straight up backdrop.
I think one of the things that came out of that architect-led kind of housing were lots of the spaces were, in terms of their actual footprint as a living space, were more in keeping, like you say, with the actual status of the characters. But the design of them gave us scale that you just wouldn't get in a Victorian property of the same size, or even a modern property of the same size to a large extent. But that kind of late 50s, early 60s, modernist, lots of spaces, lots of window, lots of glass. There's a beautiful location we used for Lola Franks's house, which essentially, when push came to shove, was like, it was one room to shoot in for all of her scenes. But the nature of it, and the way that it was offset, and the way there was the windows facing out into the garden, and the lighting you did, Ollie, with illuminating that at night, so we see this tableau in the widescreen frame of her moving through the space. It was things like that were such, refreshing from design as well, because it meant, on the page, my worry with something like this was that I'm reading lots of houses, and houses are, it's not the bane of my existence, but it's drapes and cushions, and that's what you're doing.
Talking about aspect ratio, just that you mentioned there, that was, because we decided to go with the certain aspect ratio, that meant we had more frame to fill. So, it had to also be interesting what we were putting in there, to be quite honest. We were going to get a lot more, and it made it made Lola's place you saw more of it, because it was a small place, and it was, it was meant to be a small place, and it was meant to feel sort of cut off and hemmed in and small, but that wide lens, that's the shape of that really kind of accentuated that, I think.
Ollie, for you, how difficult was that in shooting in some of those spaces, like Lola's, for example, in terms of the size? It was...
Well, to be honest, I mean, they're always in smaller houses. It always brings its challenges, but I don't mind it. I mean, I grew up shooting short films, like places where it'd be like your mate's house or whatever, and it was small, and it was, you know, you didn't have the luxury necessarily of big locations, and it's good because I think you go in and it doesn't generally faze me depending on what you're doing in there. I think you kind of have to go, well, I think if it's like you're saying, if it's interesting architecturally, which it is as a space, although it's small, you know, you find the angles. So like that angle outside of the house looking in at night, and you know, and then obviously you know, with the collaboration of design, so you know, you put that fantastic partition with the yellow glass in, which was great because it sort of gives you foreground, and it enables you to create some depth even in a small space. So, you know, like Carl's saying, you know, we decided to shoot 2391 with a sort of widescreen aspect ratio, which we felt would be pivotal really in storytelling and in terms of just composition generally for the show. Like we felt that it became another character within the show really, without being a point of view. Do you know what I mean? But yeah, you know, creating foreground, like, you know, with things that you put in. And so I didn't mind shooting in those smaller spaces because, you know, we also had a lot of exterior wide open spaces, and we also had bigger locations to shoot in. So I quite enjoy it. They're harder to light, I'll be honest with you. Like, you know, I was happy enough, but to kind of create mood because the light's bouncing around, and you know, you've got a wall quite close to wherever you are, so it doesn't fall away as easy, the light and everything. But you know, that's the only thing. That was the only thing. But you sort of just accept that really, and I really enjoyed it. As I say, like the main thing was it. You're right. It was, I think, you know, I wasn't as involved, but obviously I came on Recce's and I loved the spaces that you guys had found. So from an architectural point of view, it was interesting, and I enjoyed shooting in that particular space. Well, all the spaces, but that was fine really.
And Emma, in terms of one of the things that came out of that architecture and the mood books that Carl and I had started with was we ended up with quite specific, I mean, it changed throughout, but we color coded our characters in a way. Like we created environments in their world. Like from your point of view, like what was your starting point with the costume and the mood and realizing the characters? Because, you know, out of all of us, you've got the hardest job, kind of actually sticking color and form on the performers that's going to be in frame the whole time. So it's with
feelings and opinions. I think it started with there had to be a distinct difference between the detectives and Freddie and the creation of her world, and the sort of the way that she starts to sort of appropriate Baba and change Baba and bring him into her sort of carefully sort of orchestrated world. And I think that was the beginning point of the creation of Freddie, sort of like the appropriation, like cultural appropriation. I was at odds with her because she seems to have like traveled through life having, you know, sucked the life out of other things and sort of appropriated them to herself, lots of sort of animal prints and texture and sort of ideas that are sort of going on with her that are sort of hard to pin down. I think that was the sort of my starting point. Was I didn't want anyone to be able to read her or tell much about her character from the way she dresses, simply because she's sort of made it all up. It's all just a fantasy, the way that she looks and dresses and acts. And then Baba and contrast needed to just be extremely readable and simple and plain and honest and almost like his one sort of concession, that the Arsenal shirt needed to just to sort of say so much as well about his past and where he was now. And then the world of the detectives, of just being sort of honest and readable and reliable. Lola within that, especially, just being incredibly simple.
And Lola was hiding, wasn't she? I see. You know what I mean? That was the whole thing for her. Was like not to be noticed. The opposite of Freddie. I think Freddie wanted to be seen in some way, whereas Lola was sort of looking for the other. Was looking in, you know, the other direction. She just didn't want to be seen. She didn't want you to pay attention to her. I don't think, you know.
No, and I think we all really enjoyed that. Just, I mean, she essentially had one look with a variety of wholly worn, moth-eaten jumpers.
Even her
that she loved wearing, I think. Perversely, I think sometimes when you put actresses in really lovely worn out stuff, they really enjoy it. I think just because it helps with character, obviously, so much, but and comfort levels. But yeah, the holes in her coat and all of those things, I think, helped her.
I mean, one thing that I was aware of during the production was that we were given, we as in Carl and I, quite a lot of free rein in terms of location. But for you, I was aware there was a lot of other voices having opinions. No, for good or ill. It's one of the strange circumstances of it. But it's kind of like how much did you have to fight for some of those concepts, or was that reasonably straightforward in terms of?
It was all relatively straightforward, actually. I think we were sort of bracing ourselves because we were aware that we were proposing quite a distinct look for Freddie, and I think it could have, you know, her look as an escort. Her look as an escort. I think we were sort of bracing ourselves for, you know, having to really ramp up the sort of sex appeal there, which I was reluctant to do in a way. I wanted to keep her quite sort of still have an element of Freddie, and not for it to be too much of a departure, and not for it to be too sort of sexy, you know, sexy sort of Flasher Mac type situation and sort of too cliched. Yeah. So I think I was ready for that, and I was ready to kind of fight our ground, weren't we, Carl, on that? But I think we got it all through.
Well, I think it was all quite conceptually airtight, wasn't it? You know, the ideas for what you wanted to do with Freddie, you know, the sort of her appropriation of Baba, you know, where we talked about Baba being sort of, like you say, very transparent, but then she starts to kind of put things on him, and, you know, what you talked about with Jackson, it was all very sort of airtight conceptually, and I think you saw that through. So we didn't really get much kickback on. Okay. I mean, I think we went quite hard originally with hair and makeup, you know, I think with Helen and what we wanted to do with Freddie's makeup, and they at first sort of stood back a little bit from that. But actually, as the episodes went through, her hair, you know, everything that we proposed, they went with, you know, eventually. It was just quite a sort of shock up front, I think, you know.
I suppose it's that question of it's less
the only thing.
Pushback, but how do you bring them up to speed on something, you know, because, you know,
I think
across the board we had to do that.
I think as long as it's conceptually airtight, as long as you can explain why, and it's not nothing gratuitous, and everything makes sense coherently to the world, it's hard to argue against. I think, you know, it's hard to sort of say no to something, and then, you know, it's just, you know, aside from personal taste, you know, whether somebody does or not or doesn't like something because of their personal taste aside, I think as long as you're airtight around why you want to represent a character in a certain way, or a sort of location in a certain way, or shoot a scene in a certain way, or get an actor to do a certain thing, as long as it sort of makes sense within the whole, then it's hard to argue against. You know?
And I think we were quite careful about doing quite specific fittings, as you know, as it often is, and everyone was very aware of exactly what everyone was wearing. Yeah, you know, in advance, far in advance, which
like minimize the surprises.
I don't want to be having discussions about hem lengths on set. So it was. I think everyone was aware, weren't they? I think we knew that was the way to.
I mean, is that kind of like being able to be that clear with it? Because again, I'm basing kind of some of my presumptions, I guess, from the journeys of other costume designers I've worked with on other projects where there are a lot of kind of people stepping in. I remember having lots and lots of show and tells to various people throughout.
I've never done. I'll just say this really quickly. Yeah, that I've never done so many kind of like say show and tells where we've had to explain everything. Because they knew that they were getting something conceptually bold from design point of view.
Yeah, like the tone meetings were. I agree. And it was great, and I think it was a positive experience. But I agree. I've normally done sort of one tone meeting, as you're sort of nearing, the final weeks of production to kind of show what we've come up with. But and I was on later than you guys, so you may well have done even more than me. But I did at least 2 or 3 tone meetings. But I think it was fine. It was kind of like, again, like you said, Carl. I think as long as your concepts are kind of airtight, and which there always is, isn't there? We don't just go in blind. It's there are always reasons for choices, and as long as you can present that, I think everyone seemed to be on board most of the time. I felt with what we were putting in front of them. And
I think we were lucky though. I've had sign-offs before, well in advance, and you come to being on set and
I hate it.
Surprised by how things look. For some reason, it becomes a problem. I've had that, so I think we were fortunate. I think
they knew they were in for something different, and so they were just constantly checking in how different it was, but in a supportive way.
I think there was the comment from Philippa and something along the lines of, normally you see stuff in like a mood tone meeting and a pitch meeting, and it's going to get diluted by the time you shoot it. And her comment was that, like, oh God, it's exactly what you said it would be. And that was, I think, a massive point of pride, and gave us all, from within the art department particularly, it gave us a lot of confidence to push the things we needed to push in terms of the logistics and the schedule and the spend as well. Not in terms of rampaging anywhere with the budgets, but just making our case for why we had, or more the case of why certain things couldn't happen, or why certain things that were in the script. Particularly Block 2. We don't have John and Mike here from Block 2, but the world all of a sudden in Block 2 went into reality in the script. And with Lisa, our producer, over both blocks, we pushed back so hard and just said, like, we can't do that. We can't go into a hairdresser's. We can't go onto a high street, because the aesthetic and the world we've created in Block 1 will not translate with the finances that we've got. And, I think I said something on a podcast a few weeks ago in terms of like working at a certain budget scale. And it's like, this one was tight, but it was appropriately financed for what we were doing. But we had to make sure that we controlled what we were doing, and we weren't at the mercy of the script. And I think my first thing was, I think with you, Carl, looking at the first locations, and there's some descriptions about some of the architectural features in that, which we understood, and they developed some character points. And there was certain there was a beat about Jackson's character and stairs and fitness, and him and Lola and this interaction. But the way it was delivered in the script required a certain architectural feature, a lift basically. And there was no way for us to realize that in any way. We could have built something, we could have done a composite location, we could have done A, B, C, D, but we were able to go back and say, actually, like, we understand what the character beat is here. And your work with Gabby, the writer, particularly, to kind of say, what's another way of telling that? Because the logistics of this job will not allow us to make it as written. And I think that was one of the, I think, again, from a design point of view, great on the project was the support of production, and actually you having tenacity you do with them to go back and say, look, we can tell that character beat, we can tell that story in another way. We never really want to change the lines, but the what and the how needs to be something we can wrestle with, because the production schedule and the finances won't support us delivering everything at the same aesthetic if it's just, we're just working off the page as we find it.
Yeah, it was just tying us into, we'd made certain decisions that meant that we had tied ourselves into a certain sort of architecture that meant that we probably couldn't do the lift, stairs, apartment balcony thing that he'd sort of created. You know what I mean? There was sort of like a bit of a mishmash of several different concepts anyway to make that gag, I guess, work, and we actually sort of ended up making something slightly more cohesive out of it, but also kept it within our world,
I think it was that thing of on the page, the script as written is written as the real world initially, in a way. And it's written with an understanding. And so what was liberating was to take each of those settings, each of those locations, and reinterpret them in a way, not so much as like Lola's house is Lola's house and Jackson's house is Jackson's house and so on and such forth, but actually how they're delivered, diverging from what's on the page. And again, that's the sense of taking it away from expectations and saying, okay, given the time we've got, given the resources we've got, how can we make this interesting for the audience? And how,
but it was all, they knew they got something kind of, the thing with it, they knew they got kind of a police procedural thing that had all of these fantastical elements to it. So we were going to walk into this situation at some point, in terms of having to marry the two things. And what they don't want, and nobody wants, is something that just doesn't marry or get the best out of both things. So I think we were lucky. They were open to it, and they sort of let us go, okay, well, let's just see what they're going to do and support it when, if we like it. If it goes too far, we'll put our foot down. But nobody really did, because it was always like, I think they knew for something to reach or be successful, it sort of had to have an otherness to it,
Yeah. I mean, I think the finding of the police station itself at Sneath was not saved us, but in terms of, like, again, on the page, what was written in terms of the police station was
the police station. It was
well, it was even, to be honest, it was unachievable on the budget. It was like having done so many of them, the idea of taking those locations and all the different environments within the police station and having to create that from scratch was something that I took a pass at quite early on, and was like, I know we're here, I know it's like an anchor for the show, but it'll become the most money hungry environment. We're not, but the fortuitous nature of walking into that, essentially the engineering drafting office with mottled glass partitions and those beautiful green blinds on the windows. And I think that was one of the massive benefits of the location search, particularly, was we went into spaces that had quirks, and that had visual quirks and architectural or interior design quirks that you might have come to independently, but it would have taken a while to get there, and you would have actually had to have done some convincing and push people and say, actually, no, we'll take it here. But we had photo reference, and we'd been to these places, and we'd stood there and seen design ideas, which I know if I was selling to a producer would be an ask. Like, I'd have to draw the shit out of it. There'd be lots of visuals, there'd be lots of discussion, there'd be lots of like, well, are you sure? Whereas we walked into some of these environments that had textural details and color details that we just took, begged, borrowed and stole and brought into our environments. But that was, I think, an enormous boon for design, particularly in terms of selling some of that stuff, and letting us dodge the norm again.
Yeah, exactly. Getting on board with it. It actually really defined the police look. I guess you'll get onto it, but it was not Freddie's place, the call center that was the strangest location to try and create, because it doesn't exist, right? That they don't have call centers, I assume, for sex chat lines, because you can do that in your house or wherever. So it's like, you're creating an entirely new, and I think in the script it just said call center. Didn't really say anything. And then, for me, in my brain, I got this idea of a cab office. And then you brought in all the references for dirty, pretty things. And then we went and looked at like sort of sweatshop type places on top of other places that had been other things, and looked at, we thought it would be like in a place in Dalston that had like been appropriated into different stuff, and that was a real invention of a space. It was just taking on some sleaze elements and sort of, which is appropriate, and sort of throwing it into something that literally doesn't exist.
Oh, I think that was, the idea of kind of creating a convincing environment for the audience so they understood what was happening, but there's no reference for, like, it doesn't, like you say, it doesn't exist, because we had so many. So in the story, Freddie freelances essentially a sex line, but it's a call center environment, and there's a chap, Larry, who essentially his office is massively influenced by sort of mini cab offices and that sort of stuff. Some great, and again, that's the thing of these recce's, like finding these environments, sending the scouts out to go and photograph every minicab office. And we sort of knew we'd be doing it ourselves somewhere, but that level of detail and the way those places work. But the idea, again, like you say, of, I think Larry's call center was, we talked a lot about going back to from the cab office, but that's it. He literally is running a cab firm as well. And there are, there are webcam booths upstairs in the building. And it's that idea of like, what's beyond the shop fronts, if you go down Kingsland Road, what's behind that? And as you walk around, when we were recceing, I think again it was that sense of seeing environments or seeing the exteriors of buildings that let you start to imagine what was inside. Because rather than saying to the scout, find us an office space to do a call center, we'd have just got like an open plan space in Watford, and the same with the police station.
Yeah.
But that sense of walking around and looking and seeing certain types of windows on buildings.
Well, like I said, the script just said call centre, and the script just said police station, and the script just said house, so we filled in the gaps.
But it's kind of, I think it's nice to have that opportunity. Again, it's quite often rare because the characters we were fleshing out have an established in kind of like in storytelling, like people understand who they are, but they're not massively, I guess, beyond films, they're not something the audience will interact with on a daily basis. Whereas quite often, I think if I reference something like Bodyguard, we were dealing with ministers and what we understand that level of kind of that echelon of society lives in. Whereas this was a sense of like, okay, what's the stylized version of not an underclass, but that what's going on behind the scenes in London, like the things you don't see. And we talked about alleyways particularly, which came into the alleyway scene we were talking about earlier. But it is that sense of, like where can we just turn off what you as an audience member would know of Dalston on that street? Where can we take a right turn, and where can we look down an alleyway and find something else? So that kind of investigation of an idea of a world was really fun. I mean, I think, and again, omitting certain elements, certain things that are expected or people understand, and just saying, actually, if we stay away from that. There was one of the great last minute finds was literally the railings where we do the exterior of the call center. And it is just this brutal mill building, essentially, or what it looks like, kind of, Victorian 4 stories, bricked up windows, and it's dark and it's dodgy. And it was one of those little moments. And I refer back to when pushing back on this stuff. There's one of my favorite films of all time, but there's a beat in Jaws where Roy Scheider comes out of the police station, and you do all the interior police station stuff, and he literally just walks around the corner of this white panelled house. Yeah. And that's him coming out of the police station, and you don't question it. There's no signage to inform you that it's a police station, but it is because that's
where he was.
Continuity editing and the Chief Brody's just walked out. And I think this is probably one of the first projects I've been on where that level of understanding and I guess respect for an audience, that if you take someone from somewhere interior to an exterior, they will just automatically assume it's the same space. That there's no need to reinforce it or to telegraph what's going on. Whereas I think and this is me sort of going off on one a little bit, but with television particularly, there's a push to make it so someone could drop in at any point. So if you were to catch that scene, you would be telling the audience where that person had previously been. Whereas on this, there was a commitment that you sit down and you watch this from start to finish. You don't dip in and out. Compelling in terms of the performance and compelling in terms of the story. And it was really refreshing to be able to have that conversation and just say, well, when that call comes in and says, oh, we're going to put some signage up on the wall, and it's like, well, we don't,
Can I need it?
Yeah.
Can I just? I think you hit the nail on the head. You kind of said there's a thing in television to let that you're trying to let people drop in at any point, and I think that's exactly it. Obviously we knew it was television, but ultimately we're trying to make film, like mini film, like we're trying to make it filmic and shoot it filmic and treat it like film. I mean, that's, you know, ultimately I think where you should be trying to aim. Even, I mean, television is going more that way now, and I think you're right, the commitment towards that should be that, because what, you know, otherwise you're just making something that's a bit watered down, and why would you want to do that?
Because actually you do water it down, because you know, in my experience, the resources and the time you put into doing that can be spent elsewhere. And, you know, my feeling is always we can trust the audience. They will understand where they are, without having to spend X on this, that, and the other. But yeah, it's very satisfying. Was there anything in terms of, I guess, the sort of script delivery and changes, or anything that's kind of like felt like last minute where you had to, particularly all of you in a sense, reinvent what you thought you were going to do and respond in short order? Is there anything that last minute save? I mean, I think for myself, it really was finding Sneath Engineering and just realizing that the budget allocation I'd marked for the police station did not have to be spent, because we had a walk-in essentially, you know.
What level? I mean, there's quite a few things that turned out differently than I thought they were going to.
I suppose this is more a question about like the pressure of trying to do something cinematic on a TV schedule. And I mean, like, what were we 10 days in EP or something like that? Or
yeah, it's tight as, yeah.
I think from my point of view, it was more trying to preserve what was in the scripts and keep them as they were. And what I mean by that is, obviously, so you're given a sequence, or you read a sequence within a script, and you say, okay, well, this is what we're going to, it's at night, this is what we're going to need to do it. And then, of course, you know, everyone, you know, it's a team, you're working together, and what then happens is, well, we're not sure we can afford to do that. We're not sure we can meet those demands. We're not sure we can potentially, and then what then happens? Well, what if we change the script to the scene is now not at night, it's in day, so that we've got, you go, well, okay, then no, but we don't personally, I mean, that's not for me as a director of photography would say, you know, well, you can't do that, but in my opinion, that would be a wrong thing to do, because you, and Carl will back me up on this, but then, you know, in that scene, you'll lose the jeopardy, you'll lose the intensity, you'll lose so much from it. So I think it was then trying to sort of, you know, make compromises in other areas so that you can preserve some of those bigger scenes and those bigger moments and those bigger elements. It wasn't so much about having to make last minute adjustments, but really making compromises in other areas that you wouldn't notice as much to preserve those, you know, those bigger moments.
I mean, I remember that discussion quite vividly in terms of the back and forth with production about whether or not that is night, and you two were both like rock solid on it having to stay. And I think that's to their credit, particularly as well, is like, as much as the economies of it and the schedule pretty much dictated that it couldn't be the case, everyone stuck by it in the end, and we shot it as written. Because like you say, it's quite often, and I've done it on, you know, on independent features particularly, where, like you say, something's written as night and you realize that it's going to be too expensive to shoot, and rather than re-rationalize the scene and try and make it work, it just gets moved to day, and the impact goes out of it completely. Because I suppose it's like there are certain beats in any script which are that you interpretation, and some stuff is just like, no, that has to happen, otherwise
for it to kind of have its impact, that stuff had to happen at night. You know, there's just no way around it. You sort of you're doing more than interfering with or saving pennies. You're interfering with the sort of integrity of the story. You know, you're taking value away. You know, the whole idea is that you keep as much value on screen as possible, and there are some things, you know, you fight for, and everybody does, and it ended up in there anyway. But you know, you see the edges a little bit too much. You know, you kind of you're pulling at the strings of it a little bit too much, and like I say, damaging the integrity of the story a little bit. I think, for, talking about what was hard to shoot, I think the hardest stuff to realise in as interesting way as I wanted it to do was all the grave stuff, because of the schedule, trying to shoot that because of the weather. To be quite honest, like, it rained and then it didn't rain, and then it rained, and it didn't rain, and it rained, and we just had to shoot in the rain, and it was such a technical task to pull off the way we wanted to do it.
I mean,
and
didn't you go back and shoot that a few times in terms of like?
Yeah. Well, there were quite a few scenes with it, and it was sort of the one element that I felt was a little bit, could have had a bit more impact to it, could have been a bit more visceral. It's great, it came out really well, but it was one of the hardest things to try, and in the middle of everything else that was going on, and to shoot all that stuff in that house, and then to go out there and kind of really get into Baba's head and his experience with the boy and his past, and really sort of do that justice, was really, really tough.
I was going to say, because that's one thing that did carry through into Block 2 was, and again, the kind of fights you guys, not fights, not, they weren't bad, but the discussions and the way things were held to, like the way the schedule got weighted to those beats, which on the page are quite small, but actually technically are time hungry and really complicated. And I think that's one of the things in the scripts. There's lots of stuff that you probably just wouldn't try and do on a procedural at the budget we were at, but the pushback and the fight to get that time and to have that conversation with Grantley as well, and say, look, that needs more time on the day, and it can't be put at the end of the day in a kind of like, we'll come to that at the last minute, because it's like, the dialogue scenes and the character beats and the moment and the emotion are important. And we did actually pick up a few bits later on against, backings and sticking, bits of living rooms in various spaces while we put a morgue in the other living room while the other unit was shooting. But it was that sense of like knowing that those moments in the script required a level of effort and a level of expenditure at the production level that I think the team actually, throughout the whole shoot, the whole series ends up with a big sequence, many guns going off and this sort of stuff. And again, it's one of those ones where you kind of, the noises that come out of the production and the crew particularly are just like, why are we here? This is quite difficult to shoot, and this is a sequence, and why are we doing this at night and all this sort of stuff? And you're just like, well, actually, it's a cinematic piece of work and it needs to stick the landing. We can't get to that point of the shoot and just throw our hands in the air and say, okay, well, we'll just work with what we've got. We've got to see it through. So those discussions and winning those arguments, because in the end, they come from like this core group of like, we're the ones tasked with realizing that world. And we've got to fight for those moments, because the economies of scale and the budget and the time and the schedule and the days and actor availability and all that sort of stuff throws you into situations. But I think the result, I love I love the way the show plays out now as well. But I think, that sense of it, the work you guys did on making sure we shot that one sequence, the strangulation sequence, at night, because if anything, that wouldn't have been believable during the day.
Yeah, that's what I mean, the integrity. Yeah, so it's just the integrity of it more than the technicalities of it. It's sort of, you're stretching at credulity. If you take some elements out, some things can hit the wall and it's fine. And we compromise massively on the actual hanging itself. I think it was, he was dragged along the floor and, by Baba and sort of slung around the tree. And that was sort of not achievable, but also not the most important element of it. Not the most important, you have to decide what you can jettison and, what's going to kind of tell the story the best as well.
Yeah. Okay. I think I'm all out of questions. Is there anything else, like particularly within the show, that you've not done before on other projects, or anything in terms of moments that you can look and say, okay, that's one that's going in the reel. That's a beat. That's a
I love, obviously, the whole murder at the end of episode 1, I think, is pretty cool.
Yeah. Okay.
In terms of technically everyone's job, I think kind of comes together there really. It was the sort of realization of everything that sort of built up in that episode and was sort of the style point for all of the other episodes, I think.
I mean, it massively informs everything.
Yeah, it's the bit that stays with everybody. Story-wise, everything spins off it. Look-wise, everything spins off it, and it's just, it's a successful piece, that whole end section, I think.
Okay, and I hope we haven't put too many spoilers in, because the show goes out in about 14 days in the States. And on the I think it's on the 9th of August, 10 p.m. on Showtime. So beyond what that means in a global sense, I've no idea, but it's lovely to know that other people are going to watch it. So.
Good.
All right, great. Thank you all. Unless anyone's got anything else they kind of feel they want to let off their chest, but I've got a few things to say. So more information about the British Film Designers Guild, including membership, can be found at britishfilmdesigners.com. But massive thanks to you three for coming on and letting me sort of ask you questions, but mostly just let you get on with it.
You're such a pro. If all else fails, you can just start your own chat show.
Indeed, from my attic. It's the way. It's quite a way to get to from London, but it's fine. It's fine. It's amazing. And I'm, I can say I'm so proud of the work on the show. I'm so proud of the experience on the show, like the sense of community and collaboration that we all had. It was a proper blast.
It's a very good team. It was a really good team.
Let's do it again.
Absolutely.
Cheers, guys. Bye-bye.
See you later, guys. See you later.